Will you pray with me? Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Whenever I hear Luke's version of the resurrection story, I'm struck by this question. How do you tell a story when the main character doesn't even show up? How do you convey the wonder and the hope and the glorious impossibility of the resurrection with just a big empty to show for it? That is the challenge facing the women this morning, standing outside of the empty tomb with their burial oils and cloths at the ready. That is the challenge facing the men waiting for them in the upper room. And if we think that story was a hard sell 2,000 years ago, it is even more so today. In an enlightened, postmodern, prove-it-to-me world, our minds simply can't comprehend such an interruption in reality. We are a miracle-resistant culture. If it does not compute, it does not exist. And this is a big miracle. For resurrection isn't resuscitation. It's not like the Walking Dead Easter edition. The absurd and outlandish claim of resurrection is that God actually steps in to our human history, our human experience, our Good Friday world, and creates an entirely new reality altogether. No wonder the women were frightened and the men thought they were nuts. And yet here we are, again together this morning, sharing this ancient story of an empty tomb and straining to make the leap from our hip, protective, modern cynicism to embrace an idea that is pure possibility, pure hope. And it's a struggle. For we know all too well the power of that Good Friday fear. We see it daily. We see it on the streets of Paris and Brussels and Nigeria and Ankara and Damascus and Detroit and Chicago and Juarez. Places where anger and hate and poverty and fear stake their claim. How do we tell a resurrection story there? And we see it in Newark and Flint and Ferguson and Cleveland and Baltimore, places where racism and neglect and bigotry rule. How do we tell a resurrection story there? And we see it on the Senate floor and the campaign trail, where distortion and division and ugly rhetoric mask the truth and pit neighbors and communities against each other. How do we tell a resurrection story there? And we see it in our own lives. When relationships fray and checkbooks don't balance and the biopsy does not bring good news, how do we tell a resurrection story there? Where is the hope? Where is the possibility? How do we speak of the glory of God and sing of an empty tomb and proclaim with joy that Christ is risen when the world keeps telling us a crucifixion story? It has been said that power consists in deciding which story shall be told. Day in and day out, we are at the mercy of the story that the world chooses to tell us. Easter Sunday is the day when we celebrate the power of telling a new story, a different kind of story about a different kind of power, the kind that turns enemies into friends, that places compassion before judgment, that heals us in our broken places and offers us an experience of abundant life that makes death a mere footnote on our human journey with God. This is the powerful new story that Luke tells us this morning, and yet it begins quite literally and rather ironically with the tiniest of words. It begins with an unassuming yet defiant little conjunction that dares to interrupt the Good Friday story we have been living in. It begins with the word but. Luke uses it 5 times. But on the first day of the week at early dawn, they came to the tomb. But when they went in, they did not find the body. But the men in the tomb said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead?" But these words seemed to the apostles like an idle tale. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. For such a short passage, this gospel has a lot of buts. Because that little word is a game changer. It makes everything that came before it yesterday's news. It allows for the possibility that the ending we have come to expect might actually be a beginning we could never imagine. Resurrection. And resurrection means that the Good Friday world that divides us against each other, the one where violence and domination and fear win, that one that silenced Jesus on that awful Friday night, does not have the last word. Hope does. Love does. God does. Resurrection rewrites our story completely. But where I believe most of us get tripped up in the resurrection story is that we keep it too small and too literal. We accept it as a one-time event, an ancient event that we either have to believe against all evidence or discard as a fairy tale told by idle women. The men hiding in the upper room felt that way until they saw it for themselves and they let that little word, but, disrupt their lives too. Because but makes the resurrection bigger than that first Easter morning and offers us the outrageous possibility that we might have a different ending too. For what if the resurrection is not some litmus test of ancient Christian belief, but a reality that is hidden from us in plain sight? What if resurrection, rather than being the centerpiece of a static creed, is the unveiling of our true nature, the way it was always intended to be? What if God's actions in Jesus are the first glimpse of what awaits us all, not just after we die, but even as we live? Or to paraphrase the Apostle Paul in his letter to the little church at Corinth, what if the Easter event of the resurrection is the logical conclusion of what God started in us at Christmas, what the theologians call the incarnation? For in choosing to be born as a refugee child on the outskirts of occupied territory of Palestine, in choosing to struggle with our human experiences of pain and loss, and yes, even death, God chooses to imbue our limited lives with his unlimited grace. She enters our story and changes it forever. The incarnation means that every aspect of our lives, even the flawed, confused, and broken parts, no, especially the flawed and confused and broken parts, are given a divine dignity. Our human suffering is given divine meaning. And death is not an ending, but a transition to the fullness of life that immediately resides, that ultimately resides in God. This is clearly a message of hope beyond our physical lives, but it also speaks to our existence here and now. For if indeed God has entered our human story, we cannot remain divided against ourselves, pitting our bodies against our spirits. All is one, and all is in God. With that defiant little conjunction, that 3-letter game changer, God says to us, I know your lives are hard and full of pain, but I am with you through it all. I know the world has told you that hate and fear and death always win in the end, but they don't. Love does. Resurrection is the inevitable result of God's outrageous choice to share our lives and our deaths, which means we have nothing to fear. Nothing to fear. And so this is how we tell the resurrection story in the places where it is hardest to hear it. In Brussels and Damascus and Juarez and Flint, where the Good Friday story of terrorism and racism and neglect and fear have been the dominant story. Because the resurrection gives us the power of a new story, God's story. The one that reveals that if there is nothing that separates from God, then there is certainly nothing that separates us from one another. It reveals to us that our divisions of race and creed and status and identity are and always have been an illusion. It unmasks the lie of the Good Friday world that power is found in violence and domination and fear. Instead, we can choose the power. We can choose to tell a different story through how we choose to live and how we choose to love. For Christ is risen, any place where we choose to tell God's story. When refugees are met at the border with warm clothes instead of angry words, Christ is risen. When we put the health and safety of our most vulnerable ahead of the bottom line of our budgets, Christ is risen. When we learn to truly listen to the pain of someone other to us with compassion and not judgment, Christ is risen. And when we dare to speak up for love when our leaders are spewing hate, Christ is risen. Because power is found in deciding which story shall be told, so we can tell God's story. Whenever we are tempted to believe that the Good Friday word has had the last word on life and death, we can choose instead to reach for the first word of the resurrection story. But wait, God has a different ending in mind for us, and it's only the beginning. This is our story. This is our creed. Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. Thanks be to God, and amen.